Chapter 1. Footprints. The sound of an unfamiliar voice awakened Nora. She sat up and rubbed the sleep from her eyes, listening intently. The full moon illuminated her room with a dull grey hue, casting shadows every which way. Peering about her to see if anything was out of place, Nora wondered whether she had really heard a voice, or if it had simply been a dream. Her eyes darted about, resting first on the bookshelf opposite her bed, and then to her right, where her desk stood against the large double windows overlooking the front of the house. Moonlight streamed in over her school notebook, which lay open with her purple pen still resting atop it. She had been writing down all her many adventures from the summer as part of a recent home school assignment. Gazing back to the left of her bookshelf, she leaned forward, squinting her eyes, and attempted to look into the darkness of her closet. After a few seconds, Nora, confident that nothing was lurking there, continued scanning the room. The bedroom door to the left was still closed, just as she had left it. Maybe it was a dream, Nora concluded. She took a deep breath and felt her heart rate slowing to normal. She was just laying back on her pillow when suddenly she heard it again. It was faint but distinct. A boy's voice. "Come on, work, you stupid thing." With a start, Nora sat upright again, swallowing hard. She supposed it could be one of the neighbor boys, but it didn't sound like any of them. And the nearest neighbors were half a mile in each direction. Crawling out from beneath the comfort of her warm blankets, she began slowly tiptoeing towards the windows. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught the sight of a darting flash of light. She froze, heart racing. Had she imagined it? No. She definitely had seen something. As she took another step, suddenly it appeared again, small and translucent, and erratic, flickering light darting about the room in a chaotic fashion. Transfixed on the mysterious light, she had almost forgotten about the voice until it returned, interrupting her thoughts. "Come on! Now is not the time to stop working! Gah! Work!" Walking over to windows that gave her an expansive second-story view of the front yard, Nora climbed onto her desk and peered cautiously outside. The moon shone brightly, cascading an eerie glow over the scene below. From its beams, she was able to see everything as clearly as if a giant spotlight was illuminating the yard, casting long, dark shadows across the lawn. Nora lived in a 2.5-story house that was comfortably nestled atop a small hill on a rural country road called Johnstown Lane. From her bedroom window, she was able to look out across the large field that stretched for miles on the other side of the road, its reaches nearly endless until interrupted by the mountain landscape which loomed far behind it. In the ghostly moonlight, it suddenly seemed strange and foreign, though she had spent many a night running through it with her brothers, playing ghost in the graveyard and hide and seek. It was late September, and an early frost had settled in during the night, leaving the air unusually cold for this time of year in Vermont. The grass was crisp with the dew of the ground which had crystallized during the night's chill, and now sparkled in the light of the moon, accented with the early loss of leaves. She looked left, then right, then back again, straining her eyes, determined to spot whoever it was that had disrupted her sleep. The sudden sound of the voice perked Nora's ears. Pulling the window latch as quietly as she could, she raised it gingerly so that it would not squeak and awaken her parents, or worse, alert the boy to her presence. Resting her head just above the ledge, Nora looked out, scanning the yard from edge to edge. No sign of anyone. Nora eyed the maple-lined driveway, barely able to make out the mailbox at the end. In the light of the moon, the family's name, Hollingsworth, was barely visible alongside the house number, 1513. Unable to spot anything out of the ordinary, she turned her gaze to the large weeping willow that stood almost directly in the middle of the spacious yard. It was a particularly large tree, and its branches hung low, hovering only a few feet above the ground. Willowy, as she had affectionately named it when she was just 5, had always been a place of refuge to Nora. Familiar and comforting, she had spent countless hours lying under its shade on warm summer's days, nailing boards between the largest branches to make a perch for herself, or scrambling up the tree as fast as she could to beat her brothers in a race to the top. Now it seemed to betray her, obscuring the object of her search. She stared as long as she could without blinking, but the moon was unable to penetrate the yellowing canopy that stood like an umbrella, shielding its depths from any attempts at illumination. It was impossible to see if the owner of the mysterious voice had taken shelter under the willow's branches. She looked to the right of the yard. The evening frost clung to the row of birch trees that marked the separation between the neatly manicured lawn and the wild, unkempt field that began just beyond. Nothing. After a long, undisturbed moment, Nora began to think about returning to bed when she heard the voice again, cutting through the shadowy silence of the night. "I knew I should have bought a new one. I can't believe I let Lawrence talk me out of it." Nora jumped and felt her heart begin to race again. She strained in an attempt to look harder. Pressing her face against the screen, she looked as far left as she could. Barely able to make out the edge of the garage, she couldn't see anything that resembled a person. Turning her head and pressing just a bit more on the screen, she peered to the right. She could barely see the edge of the house, and it was while she was staring at the house's edge that her heart leapt as she saw something move. She wasn't positive that she had seen a person. In fact, it very well could have been an animal. Living out in the country meant that it was not uncommon for their yard to be visited occasionally by various woodland creatures. Maybe it had just been a deer. Feeling a bit disappointed, she leaned back from the screen, her face cold from the crisp night's air. Frustrated that she had been unable to spot the trespasser, she reached up to close the window. But as her hand gripped the latch, something moved just at the edge of her vision. Pressing her face against the screen once more, she just barely caught sight of a stooping figure pacing about by the right corner of the house. Unfortunately, the row of birch trees, although a thinner timber, together created a large shadow that hung over the edge of the yard, stretching to the side of her house and making it impossible for her to distinguish any features or characteristics that might help her identify the intruder. "It definitely said this direction, but which one?" Nora heard him say. He sounded annoyed or maybe distressed. His voice was too faint to be sure. Nora pressed a bit more, the screen now enveloping her face, as she fought to catch a glimpse of him. The figure was just out of view, and Nora was afraid that if she applied any more pressure, the window's screen would surely pop out and any chance of solving the mystery would be lost. Taking several deep breaths, Nora quieted herself for fear that her breathing would be heard below. And then it happened. At last, the figure, still pacing, walked just far enough past the edge of the house for Nora to see him before he turned and was again lost from view. He was still in the shadows of the trees, but from what she could tell, it was definitely a boy, roughly the size of her oldest brother Will, who was 15. Nora hadn't been able to distinguish much else, but it was then that she noticed for the first time that the boy had left footprints in the frosted grass. Instantly, she began searching for more tracks, and soon spotted several that led from the row of birch trees to the side of her house. Looking up towards the road, she saw that the tracks led from the birch trees to the middle of the yard. Scanning more carefully now, she could see the tracks circled about almost directly in front of her window before leading off to the side of the house. Turning to face the nightstand that sat next to her bed, she saw that her purple alarm clock read 3 a.m. Who on earth would be awake and wandering about their yard at 3 a.m.? She wondered if it could be Dylan, the best friend of her twin brothers, Elliot and Ethan. But Dylan lived at least a mile down the road. There was no way he had walked all the way here. In fact, Dylan rarely walked anywhere if he could avoid it. A rather chubby boy, Dylan could rarely go a minute without eating. Come to think of it, Nora wasn't sure he had even been to the twins' room, because that would have actually required him to go upstairs. Though all three boys were barely 14, not even 2 years older than Nora, they were constantly reminding her how much older and wiser they were. Nora was only 12, but she wasn't one to just sit back and let a mystery go unsolved, no matter what time it was. She was determined to get to the bottom of who was wandering in her yard in the middle of the night. She knew she could easily sneak out of the house, find out who had been wandering about the yard, and be back in bed before anyone awoke. She just needed to be extra quiet. Closing the window as carefully as she could, she climbed off her desk and crept across the room to her closet and slipped on her purple fleece bathrobe. She slowly turned the handle of the door until she heard the soft click of the latch bolt. Pulling it open just enough to allow her slender frame to sneak through, but not wide enough to make the hinges creak, she stepped out into the hall and quietly shut the door behind her. Alone in the darkened hallway, Nora paused and looked toward her brother Will's room, which stood to the right of her own. His door was shut, and there was no sound from within. For a brief moment, Nora thought that perhaps she ought to wake him, but if she did that, the twins would never let her live down the fact that she hadn't wanted to go outside alone in the dark, and this would inevitably result in her being called a scaredy cat until some other name became their new favorite. Looking past Will's room, her gaze rested on the twins' door, which sat slightly ajar at the end of the hallway. Walking over to it, she could hear their loud, steady breathing and knew she had not awakened them. The fact that they were asleep while she was about to go outside on an adventure gave Nora a boost of determined confidence. They'd be so impressed when they heard that she had gone out alone in the middle of the night to confront a mysterious intruder. Turning around, she walked down the hall, being careful not to step too heavily on the wide plank maple floor. The last thing she needed was a creak to wake her parents. Reaching the stairs, Nora stood for a moment gazing down, just a few feet away from the entrance to her parents' bedroom. Their door was closed, and no sound of stirring came from within. Her hands began to shake ever so slightly as she thought about what they'd say if they caught her trying to sneak out of the house at this hour. Nora was used to getting in trouble. Her imagination often led her into more mischief than her 3 older brothers combined. On more than one occasion, she had trailed off from her family while on vacation, often in pursuit of something she had found interesting. Unlike other children her age, she was not distressed by being separated from her family or finding herself alone. Overconfident and much too daring for her own good, she was used to hearing her mother's exasperated tone reminding her that it was dangerous to wander off without someone accompanying her. And now, like so many times before, Nora once again found her attention fixated on something. Only this time, it was a strange boy outside and a trail of footprints that could reveal his identity. She wouldn't be content until she had gotten to the bottom of the matter. She hovered indecisively for a moment, the thought of her parents' reaction warring with the burning determination to solve this newest mystery. In her mind, she could already hear her mother scolding, "Nora Kathleen Hollingsworth," as she so often did when Nora got into trouble. She thought of her father. He would be stern, but would probably let the matter drop after a brief warning. He had a tendency to always be a bit more gentle with Nora, and whether this was because she was the youngest or because she was the only girl, she did not know. But the pull of an unexpected adventure and the desire to satisfy her curiosity was too strong to ignore. She shook herself. This was no time to be distracted with what-ifs. No, she needed to stay focused. For Nora, leaving a mystery unsolved seemed far worse than the risk of being caught. And with that, she descended the dark maple treads. Although there was no runner on the stairs and they were nearly 100 years old, Nora had snuck up and down enough times to know exactly where all the squeaky spots were. With the finesse of a choreographed dance, Nora descended swiftly. Skipping across the kitchen and living room, she arrived in the mud room where she quickly slipped on her favorite pair of rain boots, the purple ones with white polka dots. She started to reach for her coat, but decided against it. After all, she really was only going to see who the footprints belonged to, and then come right back inside. With one last steadying breath, she reached for the front door and turned the deadbolt, unlocking it gingerly, then stopped. She held her breath, straining her ears to hear if anyone upstairs had awoken. All was silent. The only sound was the grandfather clock ticking steadily in the living room behind her. Nora hesitated a moment more, heart racing. Then, placing both hands on the handle, she pulled open the large oak door, slipped through silently, and closed it behind her with care, stepping out at last onto the spacious covered porch. The autumn night was crisp and cold, and as she inhaled, she could feel the brisk air filling her lungs. Exhaling, Nora's breath hovered before her face in a small cloud, briefly illuminated in the moonlight before fading away. There was a light wind, and Nora wrapped her bathrobe tightly around her against the chill and impatiently brushed her long auburn hair out of her eyes as she stepped out from the safety of the front porch. Fall was well underway, and the leaves had already turned brilliant shades of yellow, gold, orange, and red. Moving toward the corner of the house where she had last seen the figure of the boy, Nora tried to walk as lightly as possible, but the sound of the freshly frosted grass crackling beneath her seemed almost deafening in the stillness of the night. Arriving at the edge of the house, she placed her hands on the dark blue clapboard siding and felt it send sharp cold chills through her warm hands. Hunched over in an awkward position and trying to remain hidden, Nora slowly peered around the corner, breathing heavily and heart pounding. She braced for what she half expected to be a face-to-face encounter with whoever it was that she had seen. To her relief and slight disappointment, she didn't see anything at all. Stepping out from the shadowy corner, she stood in full view of the side lawn that stretched down past the house and ran several lengths back before joining the woods. Scanning the yard, she could see no movement other than the soft wave of the birch leaves in the night's breeze. Looking to the ground, she saw that the footprints led to the backyard. Following them slowly, she rounded the back corner of the house and stopped. They went right up to the back entrance of the house, backtracking around the deck, then crossed the yard to the shed. Nora's heart quickened. Of course, the shed, she thought to herself. It was the perfect place to hide. The shed stood back from the house, almost halfway to the edge of the woods. On the left side there was a small door that overlooked the backyard. Nora eyed it suspiciously, but everything appeared undisturbed. The two large front doors were sealed, and the only movement Nora spotted were the shadows from the enormous overgrown lilac bush that loomed from behind the shed. Peering closely at the ground, Nora was able to make out the trail of footprints leading up to the front doors before rounding the corner toward the side door. As quickly and quietly as she could, she ran to the shed. Then, back, shoulders, and head flat against the rough siding, Nora moved cautiously to the edge, eyes fixed on the corner she was about to turn. Her hands trembled slightly, but despite her fear, her heart was alive with the excitement of adventure. She was confident that this was going to be one story that even the twins would be jealous of. Turning the corner at last, she braced herself, but to her shock, no one was there. Turning to her right to face the side door, she saw that it stood slightly ajar. Now, if there was one thing Hollingsworth children knew, it was to never leave the shed door open. Their father was very particular about this, and had repeatedly corrected and disciplined his children to the point where they were more afraid of leaving the shed door open than they were of breaking a lamp or picture frame. Nora knew neither she nor her brothers had left it open. Whoever it was trespassing about their yard must have gone into the shed. Standing at the door's edge, Nora peered into the darkness, heart racing. She knew she needed to go and see for herself who was in there. Yet fear held her back. What if she were wrong, and it wasn't a boy she had seen after all? What if it were actually someone dangerous who had snuck into their yard to steal from them? Nora stood paralyzed as this thought filled her with cold dread. She swallowed hard, sweat beading on her forehead, and gazed into the impenetrable blackness beyond the half-open door, unable to decide what she ought to do. And then it happened. Without warning, Nora's entire body tensed as something or someone ran past her from under the overgrown lilac bush to her left. Seeing the movement from the corner of her eye, Nora screamed, adrenaline coursing through her. She spun around, heart nearly beating out of her chest, just in time to see a figure already in a full-out run. At last, she was able to see clearly who it was that had awakened her. It was indeed a boy, perhaps 15, with shaggy, sandy blonde hair. He was slender, wearing knee-high boots of some kind, and what appeared to be a dark green cloak, which flew out from behind him as he ran. As she stood there frozen, she watched as he ran directly towards the woods. Nora wanted to call out and tell him to stop, but her voice was still choked with fear, her throat completely dry. Unable to bring herself to say anything, she decided to run after him, expecting him to stop when he reached the thick undergrowth at the forest's edge, or at the very least slow down. But as she followed, she realized that he was not going to stop. Instead, he was running faster, barreling at full tilt directly towards the shadowy gloom of the trees. She wanted to warn the boy to slow down, but before she could say anything, he ran straight into a tree. Nora let out a scream, clasping both her hands over her mouth, and stopped in her tracks. The boy had completely disappeared. She stood, shivering in the grey moonlight, staring at the place where the boy had just been, breathing hard, her breath clouding around her in the cold night air. What had she just seen? Was this a dream? She pinched herself and flinched from the pain. She was definitely awake. Had she really seen the boy run straight into a tree and vanish? Unlike previous occasions, this time she was sure that what she had seen was not a byproduct of having an overactive imagination. Maybe her eyes were playing tricks on her, she thought. Maybe he had simply run into the woods. It was dark, after all, and the thick canopy of the forest made it nearly impossible to see beyond its edge. Hesitantly, she moved closer to the looming shadow of the trees and peered into the darkness. Nothing. Walking over to the tree where the boy had vanished, she inspected it carefully. Running her hands up and down the circumference of the large trunk, she felt for any abnormalities that might explain the impossibility she had just witnessed. Nothing felt amiss. Turning her right hand into a fist, she beat against it as if knocking vigorously on a door. Why she was surprised by the sharp pain that followed, she did not know. She had half expected that her hand would pass right through. Disappointed, she wondered how she was ever going to explain to the twins what had happened. There was no way they were going to believe anything she told them, even if she left out the part about the boy running into a tree and vanishing. Nora sighed and turned slowly to make her way back to the house. Then, all at once, from within the depths of the forest, she heard the unmistakable voice once again. Mind racing, Nora wondered how that was possible. Just moments earlier, she had seen the boy run straight into a tree. She was confident in what she had seen, yet there was his voice, coming from deep among the trees. None of it made any sense. Wiping her eyes, Nora wondered a second time if it were possible that she were asleep still. But the throbbing in her hand and the sting of her previously pinched arm was proof that she was, indeed, awake. Every impulse seemed to drag her closer to the forest's depths. But then Nora thought of her parents. What would they say? They had always given her strict instruction never to go outside without their permission, as she was so prone to wander off. They had hoped that by setting boundaries, they could curtail her overactive imagination and keep her safely within eyesight. In particular, they had instructed her never to go into the woods without at least one of her brothers to watch over her. Although only a couple of years older than her, none of her brothers had ever gotten lost in the woods, something that had happened to Nora too many times to count. She wavered back and forth, torn between curiosity and the fear of disappointing her parents. Nora stood there confused, annoyed at her own indecision. Why couldn't she just let it go? Suddenly, the sound of the voice interrupted her racing thoughts. "I can't believe it stopped working again! What a piece of junk!" Nora looked over her shoulder at the comfort and security of her home. She knew she could simply walk away, go back inside, climb into the safety of her bed, and forget that any of this had happened. But then she'd never discover who it was that had trespassed across her yard, and the draw of the unknown, of the adventure itself, was too much for her to resist. "I'll only go a little way in. I'll stop as soon as I can no longer see the house," she thought to herself. And with that, she stepped determinedly into the forest, excited anticipation welling up within her. She was, after all, on a new adventure.